Welcome to Aircrew Interview. I'm Mike Young, your host, and this is part one of our interview with David Joe Parsons on operations in the F-14A. In this episode, David chats about how he first joined the Marines, flying the F-14 on the boat and against the F-15s, and the start of Operation Desert Storm. Remember, you can help the channel to continue putting out regular quality content by becoming a patron via patreon.com/Aircrew Interview, where you receive 4 different tiers, each having its own benefits. So don't forget to click the subscribe button so you don't miss any future videos. I also want to thank our sponsor, LACO Watches, who were one of the original companies to produce pilot watches for the Luftwaffe during World War II. They produce both A and B dial watches in different sizes to suit all tastes, which adopt the look of times gone by but still satisfied modern demands. You can check out all their models and products via www.laco.d. Thank you.
Dad asking me if I wanted to go out and see the F-102 that was just arriving in Hawaii. He was in the Air Force. He was in hospital administration, but he liked airplanes and he wanted to go. And of course I wanted to go. And we stood by a chain link fence peering through it, and they had F-86Ds up till then, and they were getting replaced by brand new F-102s. This was I think 61, somewhere around there. And so I remember standing at the fence looking, and he says, "Do you want to fly those someday?" And I said, "Yes." And I never thought about anything else ever since that. And he was great in encouraging me and making sure I did the right things to get into a commissioning path, and so that I could achieve my dream.
Awesome. But you actually didn't join the Navy at first. You joined the Marines, is that correct?
Right. Well, it was a funny thing in my freshman year of college, and I saw this poster of a beautiful top-down shot of an F-4 on a runway. It was a gorgeous shot. I wanted the poster, and there was a Marine sergeant standing by it. He goes, "Well, you want to fly?" And I said, "Yeah, but, I got a plan." And he goes, "Well, you can fly in the Marines." Every answer was, "Well, you can do that in the Marines." And then he said, "And we can give you a contract." I never heard of that. And I said, "What do I have to do?" And he goes, "Let's go take it." He took me in a room. I took a test, and he goes, "You're good. You're good to go. We'll tell you when the paperwork's ready to sign." So I was kind of blind, but we lived in Hawaii when I was really young, and I got attracted to flying. But I lived there, and we went back for my last year of high school, so we were by Kaneohe, and the F-4s out there. So I had met Marines, and my best friend's dad was a Marine fighter pilot, and I'd met him, and he was just, really a true gentleman, great officer. And I called him and to check. He was a colonel by then, and he goes, "Oh yeah, that's real. That's so." Next thing I know, I had a shaved head, and I'm running around Quantico and learning how to be an infantry officer. And But they were true to their word. But by the time that I got my commission, Vietnam had wound down. They'd signed all these people up, including me, during the waning days of Vietnam, because their demand was so high. And so we come pouring out of school, expecting to go to flight school, and they said it's going to be at least a year, maybe 2, before you can go. And so I called my friend again, the Marine Colonel. He goes, "Well, I don't want you to get stashed somewhere. I'm going to find you a good job." And so I ended up in the Pentagon, of all places, in an office with naval officers and Marines. And one thing I didn't mention is when I signed up, the Marines were heading to the Tomcat. They were committed to the Tomcat. They had their first squadron designated, VMFA 531. They were out at VF 124 when the Marines decided that the delays with the Tomcat, the cost was going through the roof. The delays, or having problems not just getting it into production, they were having problems getting the bombs to separate, which was of primary importance to the Marine Corps. The Navy didn't care. They cared about the Phoenix. They didn't care about the bombs. But the Marines did. So the Marines bailed. And here I was already very much committed to a Marine Corps career when all of a sudden they kept a few of the Marines out at Miramar, so I'm told, to be instructors, and they just scattered to the 4 winds, and the Marines went after the Hornet. So here I am in this office. I'm at lunch one day, and they knew I loved the Tomcat. There were 2 guys in the office, one pilot, one RIO. that had flown the Tomcat and been part of the first cadre. And one of them finally said, "Well, you're in the wrong service. You know that." And I said, "Yeah." And they said, "What are you going to do?" And I said, "I'm going to go fly the Phantom." And so he was pretty smart. And he says, "Well, if you want to fly for the Navy can take you. You can transfer over." And I'd never heard of that, but he had a guy stop by the office one day, and the guy talked to me for a little bit. He was another former Tomcat guy, and he said, "Okay." I just let them guide me. And one day I went to work, and back then there was a lot of protesting going on. It was still the winding down of Vietnam. So you wore blue blazers to work. So no one really knew what service you were in, except by your haircut. And so one day I went to work as by then I was a Marine first lieutenant. I'd waited so long. And I went home as a Lieutenant JG. And the Navy said, we'll take you next week if you want to go to Pensacola. So then I went down there. The only, by waiting so long, which I couldn't have helped, by the time I got to Pensacola, the whole time I was signed up to be a pilot. And I got down there, and my left eye was 20/25, and they weren't doing waivers. So I fought it for a while, but I'd met enough RIOs that I said, if I can't be a pilot, I still want to be in the Tomcat. And I respected the RIOs that I met. So I didn't have any problem. That's when I met Dave Beranek. Basically, my first day down in flight school, he was a friend of a guy that I'd known. And they introduced us, and we remained fast friends ever since.
And let's talk about some of your training, like going for as a RIO. Did you have different training from a pilot, for instance, and what types would you be trained on?
Well, the first part of flight school is the aviation indoctrination, where everybody is lumped together. Right. And so they throw you out of the back of boats, drag you in a parachute harness, you do all the swim stuff, you do the dunkers. Then you go through a standard it's basically a navigation type training at VT10 in those days for me. And you learn how to navigate, you learn about winds, you learn about weather, and you do basic flying. In those days we were in T-39s. So we'd have to fly routes, and you're basically learning how to be a navigator, and everybody that's going to be a navigator is in that training, the P3 guys, the E2 guys. And then they start breaking people out at certain people want to do certain things. Certain people are sort of invited to go certain things. But, I stuck to, I wanted to be in the RIO pipeline, which was put together with the bombardier navigators. But it was, by the time you finish it, it's very distinct. Unlike pilot training, which is kind of generic, you may go anywhere after pilot training. Mm-hmm. In the NFO pipeline, they break out the E2 NFOs pretty early, and then the P3 guys, and then they go to Air Force training, at least they did back then. And then the E2 guys actually finish up at the E2 RAG and their specific simulators. So that left the A6 bombardier navigators and the RIOs all went to VT-86, but they had airplanes that had air-to-ground radars, and they had airplanes with air-to-air radars, and we'd actually go do intercepts. So we were actually trained in our job, but the radars weren't very, advanced. I think they were F-8 radars.
Oh, really?
And, did a little air combat maneuvering at the end, only a few flights. And then back then, there were only a few Tomcat squadrons, and there was a lot of competition to get those. Even though everybody knew that, it's not so bad if you went to a Phantom squadron, because you knew they would transition within one or two cruises, because we were right at the hump. And so I fought. I ended up number one, so I got to pick. And then there was only two slots, one at Oceana, one in Miramar, and that was one of the harder decisions in my life. When they call it classing up. When I classed up right after arriving, I was in the middle of VF-102, the Diamondbacks. Those squadrons they were so funny. It wasn't a bunch of students per se. They were all fleet experienced, and there was only like two of us that were students. So then I ended up in this competition because the Starfighter guys, I got to be friends with a couple of them, and they said, "Oh, you really need to come to us." And the Diamondback guys were doing the same thing, and but the skipper, I had a little bit of this will lead in later to my call sign, but I'd had a fair amount of art training. I think that's why my photography got good. I mean, it wasn't good instantly, but I understood composition. I understood
Yeah.
light. And so I don't know how it got out, but the skipper of BF-102 was in my class, and he said, "Hey, what would you think about designing our markings? What do you think it'll look like?" They hadn't even decided yet. So I knew about the slash designs on like VF-143 and VF-84. They were right underneath the cockpit. So I said, well, you need to do a variation on that. And so I did a watercolor painting for him, and he said, okay, that's it. So I was locked into VF-102 from that point on, and pulled into their social life. So it wasn't even like I had to wait till the end of the rag. I knew I was going there, and they were going to cruise pretty quickly, so they had priority. So it was really between the skipper of VF-33 and VF-102 who got who, and but they spoke for me, and fantastic bunch of guys. And because I was fairly senior, I was a full lieutenant by then because of all this time waiting to go to flight school. My skipper at VF-102 near the end of the first tour said, you need to catch up. All these guys that are your rank are way ahead of you in hours. So what would you think about staying for an extra tour, which is called a Super JO tour? Usually they send you to a different squadron. He says, I'd like to keep you rather than take, a risk on someone else coming to the RAG. Would you want to stay? And I said, heck yeah, I want to stay, because we were about to, go do Ocean Safari, which I'd already done Northern Wedding. So I wanted to go do that again, see some bears, and stay with these guys. So I ended up close to 6 years in that first squadron, which was a great experience.
Is that an unusual amount of time to stay in one squadron?
Yeah. Usually it's no longer than 3. So they had to write a new set of orders extending me for another tour.
Wow. And you obviously mentioned the Russians there. Did you actually intercept and get to see any up close?
I don't know what it was, but whenever I got an alert jet, I launched. They were like, hey, you had some of these guys have never seen bears, and we're going to put you in alert or let somebody else fly. And I get an alert jet, and boom. I think I counted 28 intercepts.
Wow, really? That's a lot.
They were out there every day, and they had to know where we were, because we eventually worked our way up to Norway, which tickles their inner defense. So they had to know where the carrier was. They had to target the carrier every day. And of course, the carrier was trying to hide from them as best state, and that was in 82. In 85, the Secretary John Lehman had decided to really stick it to the Soviets. So they had worked out the deal with Norway to actually operate inside the fjord, hidden up against a cliff, so their radars couldn't see us, and they couldn't fly inside the fjord. Wow. So that was like amazing, and they launched so many airplanes. And my epic flight then was with the Air Wing commander. By then I was well known as a photographer, and he said, look, we need to get on the magazine. So you and I are going to launch as an extra airplane, and we're just going to go intercept everything that's out there, because they knew, I don't know how they knew, but they knew there was going to be a big day coming up where the Russians would simulate an attack on us. And they were using us for training. We were using them for training. And sure enough, we launched, and that was the only time the RIO, I don't know if everybody out there knows, they do all the talking on the radios.
Yeah.
Except if it's ACM or some safety of flight, the RIOs do the talking. He said, I'll handle the comms. And he had told the E2, when he says vector, that means we're done with whatever Soviet we have, send us to another one. And so all I had to do was worry about the cameras. And we got 2 bears, 3 badgers, and a cub, all in one flight, which finally ran out of light. We were just, but that one of those ended up on the cover of All Hands magazine, which resulted in another admiral seeing it and saying, "Hey, I want to interview you for Approach magazine." That's a great picture.
Awesome. And what kind of ordnance would you be carrying on these alerts?
Today, my last deployment in Desert Storm, we were loaded. Every single station had a weapon on it. So we would carry 2 Phoenix, 3 Sparrows, 2 Sidewinders, and full ammo. But back in those days, in 82, you only carried like one each. I think they didn't want to beat up the missiles. There was like this trade-off between don't want to beat up the missiles, but want to make sure they work. And everybody knew about the Frank-Alt report, so-called Frank-Alt report. That's not the official name, but it's a really long name about missile effectiveness that they did in Vietnam, because the missiles, the air crews they're firing out of the envelope. There were all sorts of problems. There were loading problems. There were handling problems. They were getting beat up. So they didn't really want to beat them up, but they came up with a program called captive carry. And you actually got points for carrying missiles, but they also wanted to check them out. So a lot of times you would land on the carrier and they take the side off one station, put it on. You didn't want asymmetrical loading, but they would move them around, and because they wanted to make sure. And then the RIOs had a job that I don't think I've heard anybody talk about this yet, that the F-14 had built-in tests built into the computer. The RIO ran that. There were 8 different modes. And then you had to fill out this thing called a BER card, a bit examination report. And that was very important to our IWT shop, the Integrated Warfare Team, that worked on the radars, because there were a lot of things that they couldn't check on the deck. They could only check them with weight-off wheels with the radar on.
Okay, right.
So that was, and you had to work that into your flight, that get that done. I usually try to do it right after our launch just to see what I have, because part of the bit also tuned your sparrows, so they get tuned to the aircraft, and then it would come back and tell you how they did. And you also had to, if to call this a computer would make a lot of people laugh. You probably have more power in your iPhone than the Tomcat had. It was basically, we jokingly said it was like a 64K Commodore computer, but they were very artful about how they wrote the algorithms and what you could get out of that computer. But I talked to somebody later on, they said, well, every time we introduced a new feature, we had to kill some old feature to make enough room in the computer. I don't know how true that is, but it sounds about right. So the D was a little different, that got upgraded, but at least the A's and B's had just this little analog computer, and you had the little rotary dial. You had to push a button and a light would come on, and then would read in a tape. I mean, it was archaic. I mean, people would joke about it, but that was cosmic. Coming from a T-39 with an F-8 Raider, that was cosmic. And the range the AUG-9 had was phenomenal. I never remember our longest range intercepts were against bears. Like they'd send us out hundreds of miles away to pick them up, and there they would be on the top of our radar. Wow. That radar really did it rivaled, and in some ways beat the E2 radar. Our scan was faster than the E2, and we could get a lot more data. And I've flown in the E2. I only did it once. Once was enough for me. They offered, and I said okay, to see it from their side, and our picture was a lot better than their picture. I can see why they always say the Iranians used them as basically mini AWACS. I can see why you could do that, and I've actually done that a couple times in the Tomcat.
So what angle was the radar? Like, what degrees did it give you? Like, was it forward, down, up, and the side, or like? Explain that for us.
The Tomcat could really, more so than the older aircraft. If you knew the place you were in the sector, you would want to narrow it down to get as much look as you could. But then if you weren't that sure, then you go 40-degree 2-bar, and then you had all these ACM modes, hot modes. The pilot had a couple, and the RIO had a couple that would actually work on the axis of the airplane. It could see, and I'm trying to remember the numbers of it, in excess of 60 degrees up.
Wow.
And 20 or so degrees down. I'm not sure. I'm sure you could Google that and find out. And it was a big radar. That's why the airplane was so big. It was like the antenna was like 3 feet across. And
that's huge.
A lot of times you would operate in what we call track while scan, so it could track multiple targets, and you could look out a long way in pulse Doppler. But you could set it up so if it saw an airplane, I don't think it was in the manual, but there's a way you could select that you wanted to pulse Doppler single target track while you're in track while scan. And so when we were on these really long, boring cap missions, we'd usually set it up that way. So it was like fishing, with your fishing pole in the water, and you're just sort of waiting for a bite. That when that radar saw something, it would go bang, and you could feel the front of the airplane just, move a little bit as hydraulics just focused that antenna on there, and then you got all the information you wanted on that aircraft. You weren't supposed to lock up the Soviets, but
you might have done.
I know. I just didn't do it for long. You didn't want to get them worried.
Before we move on to the F-14 in its operation in Desert Storm, you also flew the F-14B. How did you feel about going from the A to the B? I mean, there's a lot of people who dislike it. Some people love it. But what were your feelings on this?
Well, I was over at Approach Magazine as the editor in the mid 80s, from 86 to 89. And I got a call because I did really well. The way I got in photography was when I showed up in 102, they said, well, the only job left is public affairs. So you're going to be the public affairs officer. Yeah. I said, what's that? I had no clue. And I wasn't a, top photographer or anything. I had a camera that was a hand-me-down. But I got into publicizing the squadron. They said, you got to make us look better than our sister squadron, make our air wing look better than another air wing. Kind of like the old, me against my brother, my brother me against my dad, that thing. And so I had pretty good reputation at that point. So the wing called me up and said, we're going to get the first A+. Would you like to be there? Could you help us, with the photography and the PAO piece? And I said, absolutely. I want to see this thing. Absolutely. So I remember it showed up, I think it was in 87, 88. And so I went there, and after that, I knew I was going to be up for orders in 89. And I was like, I got to get in a B squadron. I got to. Absolutely. So everybody knew which squadrons they were. At that point, they were just VF-74 and VF-103. And then I think 142 and 143 followed. But so I was like looking at, when you come back as a lieutenant commander, you're going to be a department head, and there's fewer slots, and they don't want to overload them. And so I was over there talking to the XOs that had around that time that I knew, and I was talking about it. But when it came down to orders, I said, well, they really need help in VF-32. But when I went to the RAG, I got the RIOs going to the RAG. Unlike the pilots would go through and only fly the airplane they'd fly in the fleet. But the RIOs could fly the B. So I was just so looking for it. I would say I was salivating about that first flight,
I could imagine.
And I remember, and that's where I really met and got to know Oki. And, and I remember he's just like he is in the interview. He is such a funny guy, but he is really good. Mm-hmm. And he was so nonchalant about it. But when there's certain calls a RIO makes, when you get to the runway, the first one is off the peg, meaning the airspeed indicator is working, and then 100 knots, so that the pilot knows to get off nose-wheel steering, and then you got to make the airborne call. And that airplane took off so fast. I said off the peg, and the next thing I said was, holy cow. It was, like going from a Volkswagen to a Porsche. I mean, it really took off like a scalded cat. And it was just an amazing airplane. It just had so much power on tap. And I was really, even I knew I had orders at 32, and I was like, oh, I got to fly this airplane. And, years later, at that point where my first window that I could retire, and I had this great job offer, but I also had a verbal offer to go be the CAG operations officer for Air Wing 17 for my former CO in VF-32, and that meant I could fly the B. And I was like, oh, that was a hard decision, because I really wanted to do deployment in those. I wanted to go look, go find, because I don't know if this has come out in the interviews. When the airplane first showed up, the Air Force is so into themselves that, and I don't want to bash the Air Force, but the F-15s at Langley had no clue that there was Tomcats with big motors down at Oceana. And then all of a sudden they started noticing that the Tomcats were behaving totally differently. They were going vertical with them and matching them. And, so they finally, the word got out that they called it, they just said the big motors. And we were always had to do telephone interviews with them before we fought them. And,
really?
Yeah, you're supposed to do face-to-face ACM brief, but that's like a 45 minute to an hour drive over there. So they compromised on what they call a telephone brief. So they would say, okay, yeah, hard deck is 10,000. It was the same script. But at the end, this guy, my first one with him after the B showed up, he goes, very, very cool and nonchalant. He says, "You guys got the big motors?" Because they wanted to know what they were fighting. And I remember the first time I fought one and we went up with him. It might have been Oki, but we went up. He says, "Watch this. We're going to surprise the heck out of him. We're going to go up with him." And we went vertical, and we're looking canopy to canopy, and he's looking down to see what move we made. Did we do a slice turn? What did we do? And even though he had his visor down, I could tell his eyes were big as saucers. Like, what is he doing here? And
Absolutely.
and then it's like he was waiting for us to fall off first, but we did not. We didn't have tanks on. So our thruster weight was pretty similar to his, and so he lost that day. So I think a lot of it just stunned him. What are you doing here? Because the word just didn't get out to the 3 squadrons up there.
Yeah, awesome. I mean, I've looked at over your bio and stuff, and you also mentioned that the US Air Force Fighter Weapons School hired the F-14s to play as the Iranian F-14s. How did this play out, and was it with the A or B model?
That was the A model. I was in VF-32, and we had this was post the wall went down, and it was all of a sudden like there is no more Cold War, and the demands for carriers had lessened, and there was this big hue and cry for a peace dividend, and so our ship, the Kennedy, was all worked up. We were supposed to deploy, and they said not so fast, and that was summer of 1990, and so when you're not going to deploy, your parts priority goes way down. It's hard to keep your jets up, and they cut back on your flying hours because all the people deployed get all the money. So it was almost a depressing time. And one of our guys, ops officer, was looking for stuff for us to do because sometimes you can get the Air Force to pay to visit for all different things, and he found out the Air Force Fighter Weapons School was looking for Tomcats to simulate Iranians, and they didn't even want our tanks because Iranians don't carry tanks. They wanted us to perform just like the Iranians. They wanted to see what our radars stimulated them. That was the big thing, is electronically, because we found out they didn't really want to. We thought we were going to get some good fights, but they really didn't want to fight us close in. They wanted to do the BVR. They're big believers, and it played out in Desert Storm less than a year later, that they know how to run a BVR fight and do their timelines, and that they were all about their timelines, and all we wanted to do was fight, and so they're like, hey, let's not even do radar missiles, let's just get in and fight. But they were less interested in that. That was the only disappointment. They paid our whole way. They paid for us to come. They put us in a hotel with a casino, which was great for the troops. They gave us rental cars. It was great. And then Kuwait got invaded while we were there, but we got some good fights in.
Before we move on to Desert Storm, how did the F-14A compare against the F-15?
I learned more of this later. They were very quiet, and they didn't even fully debrief with us at Nellis. They'd send one guy to our debrief, and he would tell us what they saw. We would tell him what we did. Mm-hmm. These were students and instructors fighting us, so they had to do their timelines, and they had to debrief their timelines. So they did that within themselves. I found out later, after Desert Storm, I became the air-to-air missile requirements officer, so I had full insight into what they had in their airplanes and what missiles were out there, what missiles were coming. And so I saw they really had an optimized, they kept saying they had an optimized system, and they did. They view air superiority as a primary mission, and they invest in that. And everything was harmonized from their, non-cooperative target recognition, NICTR, as they call it. Everything they had in there, they and they wrote their ROE. That kind of was we were miffed about that because we didn't have all the systems they had, and they kept saying, "Well, you have to have 2 independent systems," and we only had one. Hornets only had one, different than us, so that kind of cut us out from any BVR shots. But I can tell you, going in and out of Iraq was like rush hour. And there was a couple times I know I locked up a F-117 because I only locked it up. I had it. I was in a hot mode going in at night, and they told us what lanes, what altitudes to avoid. And right in that altitude band, all of a sudden the radar locked somebody up really close. I hit our IFF interrogator, came back as a friend, so I broke the lock, and this dark thing went over us. So there were a lot of close calls that, we got vectored late in Desert Storm. We got vectored one day on a contact, and it was during the day. It was low. It was under clouds. It was right around the forward line of troops, the FIBA, and it was low. And I said, this could be a special ops helicopters. We got sensitized that there were SAS guys deep in there. They told us some places to avoid. We actually got involved. I did in looking for the Bravo 20.
Oh, really?
It was, that's a whole nother story.
Wow.
But so we knew we had to. Don't assume what you see is bad guys in Iraq, and we're cleared to fire. And at the last minute, I just put the radar in standby. I said, I don't feel good about this. This is right where those guys are. And moments after I did that, they came back and said it was a friendly. So it could have easily gone down. And it was one of those helicopters down there that later I got exposed to how they were operating. And I said, yeah, that's exactly what they were. So.
Wow. So, obviously, we're going to talk a bit about Desert Storm now. And how did you first become aware of the operation that was going over there? And did you actually think you were going to be involved?
Well, we didn't. And we were at Nellis, and it was hot as all get out. We were breaking the airplanes because we started being very wily Iranians. And I remember one day I was flying with a brand new guy. And I said, we're not even going to turn the radar on because we know that their warning gear is picking us up way out there. And we're just going to go hide down in this valley on the side of a mountain and wait for it, and just look at the clock. And I bet they'll fly over. And we're just going to come up visually behind them. And that's what we did. Yeah. We got a guy. We waited till we were in the saddle on him. And and I locked him up. And he just did this brake turn. And all that did is allow us to close the guns. And boy, he was mad. But they got sucked in to think that they were always going to see our radar a long way out and then use it against us. Mm-hmm. So we came back and we were debriefing. We're all hot. We're looking for something to drink. And our intel officer, he'd been in the nice air conditioned intel spaces. He comes walking in, all crisp and clean in his khaki uniform. And he says, "Hey guys," and we're all like, "What do you want?" And he goes, "Kuwait got invaded." And I remember one of the pilots said, "Where's that?" And but luckily we found a map, and everybody said, "Well, how will that involve with us?" We were dead last on the deployment cycle. Sarah was already heading over there, so we knew that we won't go. And later that day, we get a call from the wing back at Oceana and says, "Pack it up and get back here. You guys are going to deploy."
Wow.
And we basically arrived on a Friday. We had to do 14 engine changes. They said any engine that had less than 100 hours ago before you had to pull it, you're going to pull it now. And I don't even know where they got all the engines for us. But and the same thing was going on in VF-14, our sister squadron. So we had to replace 14 engines while we were fixing the jets that were broken from breaking the slats and all that stuff, all the ACM with the F-15s. And we had to everybody June and July. So everybody had to go through an FCLP the middle of the night and plus pack up to go. And we were leaving on Monday. And it was really a rough weekend. I can't believe the squadron did it. Everybody worked around the clock, to get all the jets ready. Plus, I knew from my VF-102 experience, my last deployment of VF-102 was the raid on Libya. And we got no notice deployed for that. And these guys came out of the woodwork that I didn't even know existed. And they came and looked at all our warning gear. It's called sweeping the jet. They swept the jets to see if the warning gear was working. And it turned out the maintainers had painted the antennas. So they came in and brought us new they're just little things like cupcake shells on our horizontal stabs. But they replaced all those, got us ready to go. So I knew about those guys, and I was a maintenance officer. So I said, I don't know who those guys were. We got to find them. Let's call around and find those guys. So they showed up and did the same thing for us. We uncovered our Mode 4 antennas, but I didn't get to go. I was getting pain in my kidney region. It turned out I had a kidney stone. As the ship left, I was in the hospital on morphine, thinking, "Oh man, this is it." And I'm sitting here in this daze, and so that's not to bore you with the medical details. Anybody who knows about kidney stones knows they're not fun, and it really poses a problem when you're on flight status. So you have three options: you can cut them out, and you're probably not going to fly again if you do that, or you can pound them out with lithotripsy, and then you have to go through a board, or you can just pass them with water and get a flight surgeon to. So I passed them with water. I lost like 20 pounds. Just drank water until I passed it, and went to a flight surgeon and went to the wing commander, and he said, he just happened to know. He goes, I tell you what, if you want to go, I'm going to write you orders. Don't go to the flight surgeon here. Go to the flight surgeon on the ship, because then it's an operational necessity and the rules are lax. Yeah. So turned out I had a couple of little ones I hadn't passed yet, when they checked me. Yeah. And they said, well, now you already passed the big one. It's cleared the way. So the little ones will go. So I got on an airplane and I flew to Sigonella, and I was there waiting as the ship came into the med. So I missed the whole cross. I showed up 20 pounds lighter and caught the ship. Everybody was like, they were shocked. And I went to see the commander, told him the story. Oh, I think, and he started to say something, and the airline commander is an old Vietnam veteran. And he goes, "Hey Joe, do you want to fly?" I said, "Yes, sir." And he goes, "Give him his shit." He didn't want to hear any of that. Brilliant. I think it was a little easier because I was in the backseat. So if I had an episode, it wasn't going to be a safety of flight issue. So, and it was funny because a couple other guys had them that didn't get diagnosed. They were on the ship. So I went down there and consoled them as they went through the painful experience of passing them.
But let's talk a bit about the F-14's role in Desert Storm. Like, what was your mission, and did the F-14, live up to, its high standards of, protecting the boat and its troops?
Well, when we got over there, our carrier Kennedy was stationed in the Red Sea along the Saratoga. As the war kicked off, America showed up, hung around for a little while, and then went over to the Persian Gulf. So we had 2 or 3 carriers there. Mm-hmm. We had to maintain combat air patrol over the north end of the Red Sea, looking up towards Jordan, because we suspected the Iraqis may try to come in. They had some unusual activity up there on their airfields that they might try to slip in, like they're Jordanian, and come down and attack the ships. So we had to maintain combat air patrol down there. And that was a nice, we had Air Force gas. That was the biggest factor over there. The Air Force, really, my hat's off to the Air Force. They made it happen. There was always a KC-135 over our ship 24/7. And then there were other,
which we both
know.
There
were other tanker anchors over the middle of Saudi Arabia. You could find gas if you needed it, and they would give you all you want. My whole career, we never had such gas. And I've heard people since then don't see that, but for whatever reason, it was there. And we took full advantage of it. So our hour and a half, 2 hours, we're going into 4 and 5 hours. I flew several 7-hour missions over there, which it became with being able to urinate. we were going through these little things we call piddle packs. And I can tell you honestly, I never used one my whole career because I could go 2 hours. You know, you just use the bathroom before you go. And we were going through it drained the supply system. And our poor little supply officer got up in front of the AOM and said, "Hey guys, could you please use the bathroom before you fly? Because we're going through these." And everybody started throwing stuff at him and saying, "Get out of here." You know, so I mean that was just an admin thing that we had to you know, deal with. But so we had the CAP missions that had to be flown, plus standing alerts. But we did during Desert Shield, we did practice missions. The real missions, we practiced the first 3 days of the war. And all the strike leads were designated, and we would fly what we call mirror image strikes, where you would all the people that were going to fly that strike would get up and they would go to the tanker anchors over Saudi Arabia, and they would fly straight at the Iraqi border. Wow. And then they would double back like there was a mirror there. Yeah. And they would still fly the same distance. They would just turn and do it different. And then they would practice the ordnance delivery inside Saudi Arabia and fly back. So we had that down. We did it over and over again. We did it with Sarah. We did it without them. So we knew that, you know, how all that would work, deconflicting on the tankers and through the air traffic control procedures. And so we were really ready. We got there in August, and we even had some Liberty calls up in Turkey. We went through the Suez Canal a couple times in Desert Shield, you know, as long as there was one carrier in the Red Sea. And because they were letting the politics play out, and we knew that if it was going to happen, it was probably going to happen after Christmas. And so we did a lot of fantastic low-level training, even though we came to the conclusion that it wouldn't be a good idea to fly low level over Saudi Arabia. Some people did, like the Brit Tornadoes. Yeah. And the Sarah A6s had night vision goggles. They were convinced that was the way to go. But we said, boy, we don't think we want to go below 20,000 feet. And so our A6s and A7s, you know, decided to fly our strike packages. In the early days, the Tomcats were basically just like the 8th Air Force over, you know, Europe and World War II. Yeah. We had cats all over the place. There was a strong contingent up front doing a fighter sweep, and then there would be Tomcats flanking the strike package, and then we'd have a division of Tomcats protecting the high value units, the prowlers, which were doing jamming at the back end. So most of these missions had 12 Tomcats.
Wow, okay.
So that was but as the war went on and the F-15s, we would only come in with the strike BVR permission, except if somebody was going to get that, it would have to be on the AWACS telling them. Yeah. So the F-15s actually were flying caps over there, so they always got the vectors when the MiGs were active. And my first mission, the MiGs were active and they faded away. They retreated as we got close to them, and we knew why. We knew our radars were just like the F-15s did with us. They could tell we were there, and they didn't want anything to do with us. So they would move away, and then they would turn around to see if the radar was there. And I was on the tail end protecting the prowlers. And sure enough, as soon as we turned and started heading south, here comes 2 MiGs trying to run us down, and they were supersonic. Wow. And we were sort of in a dilemma. We couldn't just leave. This is the old thing with Doolittle and the 8th Air Force. We couldn't leave the people we were protecting, because for whatever reason, if we didn't bag both MiGs, they would be on the prowlers with no protection. So we were trying to get the prowlers to get south and get across the border so we could turn around. So I'm heading south like this. So I went ahead and set my radar up in a hot mode to the right, because I was going to turn starboard. We were going to cross turn to take on these 2 MiG. We found out later they're MiG-29s. And so I had the radar skewed in a hot mode and immediately picked up a target. And I looked, and the velocity vector was like, it was going supersonic. I went, holy cow. I interrogated it. It was a friend. So I break the lock. I said, that's probably an F-15 coming north. And sure enough, 2 F-15s just come, you know, speed of heat, come right down, you know, our starboard side, and the missiles come off. And so I watched the missiles come off. And, you know, we did our job. And, you know, and it was a team effort. And then I met the guy later. It was a Marine pilot flying an exchange tour. And,
I think I saw. I think you posted an article about that, didn't you, recently?
Sly McGill.
Yeah.
And I, so did you see us? And he goes, what? He says, all I know is I checked in, they gave me a vector, and he punched off his tanks, and he was bore sighted on what was ahead of him. So